People often imagine castles as towering fortresses of stone, unbreakable and grim. But few realize something surprising. They were also vast pantries. Hidden deep below the stone floors and spiral staircases of medieval fortresses were underground storage chambers packed with food. Barrels of ale, sacks of grain, salted fish, dried meats, hard cheese, and flour filled these vaults. Enough to feed entire households and garrisons for months, even years. While battles raged above, another fight took place below, the battle to keep everyone fed. A castle could not stand without supplies, and a lord's rule meant little if his people starved behind their own walls. The real question was not only how they fought, but how they survived. Some castles were built not just for defense, but for storage. They were designed around food as much as fortification. No power, no refrigerators, no glass jars. Yet they managed to preserve enough to outlast sieges that could stretch across seasons. These castles fed lords, soldiers, servants, cooks, cleaners, and stable hands. They nourished war horses and hounds. They prepared troops before battle and sustained them through harsh winters when travel was impossible and trade routes froze. But how did they do it? Where was all that food kept? What methods stopped it from rotting, molding, or being stolen? The answers lie beneath the stone floors, in the hidden vaults and narrow passages where air hung heavy and cold. These were the unseen chambers that quietly held the fate of kingdoms. Forget the swords and the sieges for a moment. To truly understand how a castle functioned, you must look below the banquet halls and beyond the throne room. You must follow the food. In the medieval world, food was more than nourishment. It was power. Whoever controlled the stores controlled the outcome. A single castle could hold dozens of knights, hundreds of guards, and countless workers. All of them depended on a constant supply of bread, meat, beer, beans, salt, and grain. Every item had to be gathered from fields and forests, transported by wagon, sorted, processed, and stored under strict watch. It had to survive months of damp weather, raids, vermin, and long winters. When a siege began, gates closed, and the question on every tongue was the same: how long can we last? The answer was never about weapons. It was about bread. During the siege of Caerphilly Castle in 1295, Welsh rebels trapped the defenders inside for more than a month. The cold was brutal, yet the people inside did not starve. Beneath their feet lay mountains of stored grain. There was so much that the rats grew plump before anyone went hungry. Castles were not only symbols of strength, they were engines of endurance. And to endure, food had to be hidden, cooled, dried, and guarded. Deep beneath the floors, in chambers without windows, where the air smelled of salt, barley, and smoke, the true treasures of the castle were kept. Not jewels or crowns, but garlic, salted pork, and wine casks. In those cellars, food was not just stockpiled, it was protected. Tucked behind thick doors, sealed beneath stone, known only to trusted keepers. The secrecy had purpose. Food was wealth. It was influence. It was the quiet defense that could outlast any enemy. Below ground, the temperature never changed. It was cool, dry, and stable, ideal for everything from aging cheese to storing wine, drying herbs, keeping salt dry, and protecting meat and butter. These cold, shadowed vaults were the true heart of every castle, the silent guardians that made survival possible. These were not simple storage rooms. They were early versions of refrigerators. Rats, mice, mold, and insects were constant threats. By keeping supplies in sealed, cold, and quiet areas, exposure was limited and the food stayed safe. Thick layers of stone above blocked both sound and smell. Some castles even had hanging chambers for meat, or shelves coated in ash to keep rodents away. And oddly enough, cats were seen as protectors of food stores, valued as much as guards in some places. Fire was another danger. Torches, Open ovens and braziers made accidental sparks common. A single flame could destroy months of supplies. That is why storage was placed far from heat, below the kitchen rather than inside it. During wartime, earning an enemy's food was a common tactic, so castles defended their stockpiles with the same care as their rulers, hiding them behind walls of stone. Inside a castle, food was power. Nobles enjoyed grand meals while servants ate leftovers. When food became scarce, privilege was the only thing separating survival from hunger. Hidden stores allowed lords to keep control. They decided who ate, when, and how much. Keys to pantries often stayed with stewards or treasurers instead of cooks. Food was not just nourishment, it was strategy. During sieges, secrecy was vital. Sometimes even the people inside the walls were not told how much food remained. This prevented panic, theft, or uprising. Hunger became a test of faith. People prayed beside barrels of grain and lit candles in the darkness. Some castles built chapels near granaries, asking blessings for their supplies. A full pantry meant hope. An empty one meant despair. So yes, castles had towers, moats, and guards. But the real strength lay below, unseen, where survival was buried with the grain. Visitors to a medieval castle rarely saw food. They might catch a scent from the kitchen or hear boiling pots. But the true wealth, the provisions that saved lives, was hidden away. Medieval pantries were never in plain sight. Most were placed in the deepest levels of the keep, beneath the great hall, or near the kitchen, or tucked into inner courtyards accessed by steep stone stairs. Some were inside towers with thick masonry, some in separate storage towers sealed with heavy doors. They stayed in darkness where sunlight could not spoil food and heat could not reach it. The walls were thick, the floors stone or packed earth. There were no windows, only narrow slits or vents to let air flow. Doors were built from strong oak or reinforced with iron, often locked or barred. Some even had hidden entrances, narrow tunnels used by servants, concealed behind barrels or wall hangings. To keep supplies fresh, air had to move slowly. Castles used vertical shafts to bring in cool air, stone ducts inside walls to guide circulation, and grated holes to release gases. This created steady airflow, a simple yet clever form of climate control. In some castles, guards used these vents to listen for suspicious sounds around the storerooms. Inside, stone shelves were carved into the walls. Wooden barrels sealed with wax or pitch lined the floors. Meat hung on racks above gravel or clay jars, sunk into the ground to stay cool. Baskets held onions, garlic, and herbs. Heavier goods sat below, lighter or fragile items on top. Salt, a valuable resource, was kept in small ceramic bowls to prevent waste. In wealthy castles, servants used carved marks or symbols to track age and rotation of supplies. Pantry workers were among the most trusted staff-older stewards and young assistants who memorized the layout in dim candlelight. They used tallow candles, oil lamps, or worked in near darkness by touch. Every sack and jar was counted. Records were written if anyone could read or kept by marking beams. One mistake could cost lives. These storage chambers were not beautiful, but they protected what mattered most. They did not shine like treasure rooms, yet they held the real wealth of the castle, the power to endure. Next, we venture further into what filled these vaults and how it sustained a world built on survival. Not just the way the rooms were built, but what they contained. Today we depend on freezers, airtight packaging, and preservatives to keep food safe. But in the Middle Ages, people had none of those conveniences. Still, they managed to keep food edible for weeks, months, and sometimes even years. How did they do it? Through a careful mix of craft, climate, knowledge, and inherited skill. Their preservation was a science shaped by survival, practiced quietly in the cold darkness below ground. Meat was the most valued food, but also the quickest to spoil. To make it last, they used 4 main methods. First, salting. The meat was rubbed with heavy layers of salt and packed into barrels. The salt drew out liquid and stopped bacteria from growing. The result was tough, salty, but safe. Second, smoking. Meat was hung over slow fires fed by oak, beech, or juniper wood. The smoke coated the surface, giving flavor and repelling insects. Some smoked meat could stay edible for a whole year. Third, drying. Thin strips of meat were laid out in the sun or wind until they hardened, turning into an early form of jerky. Fourth, sealing in fat. Cooked meat was covered with melted lard or tallow in clay pots. Once the fat cooled, it formed a barrier against air and decay. The smell was strong, but it kept hunger away. Bread fed more mouths than meat ever could, so grain was guarded above all else. It was kept in canvas sacks, wooden casks, or stone bins coated with lime. The secrets were dryness, darkness, and airflow. Barley, oats, rye, and wheat were staples, each with its own use and season. Spoiled grain meant sickness or death. Many castles employed grain tasters, who would chew a sample to test for dampness or bitterness. It was unpleasant work, but it saved lives. Salt was more than seasoning, it was survival. Fish were buried in it, vegetables soaked in it, meat packed in it. Salt was so rare and valuable that some castles locked it in guarded rooms like silver. When salt ran out during a siege, food quickly rotted and famine followed. Fresh produce was rare, but clever stewards knew how to make it last. Cabbages were stored underground in cool soil. Onions and garlic were tied in nets and hung from ceilings. Carrots and turnips were buried in barrels of straw. Apples were layered in hay, turned every few days to stop bruising. Berries were boiled with honey into jam, or turned into sweet mead. Herbs and leafy greens were dried or preserved in vinegar brine inside clay jars. Milk could not last long, so it was turned into butter, cheese, or curds. Hard cheeses wrapped in wax could survive for months. Soft cheese was packed in brine and eaten sooner. Butter was stored in clay pots, covered with damp cloth, and placed in the coldest corner of the cellar. In short, they wasted nothing. Milk never stayed milk for long. Water was often unsafe, so people drank ale, wine, or vinegar-based drinks instead. Ale was brewed regularly, thick and nourishing with little alcohol. Wine aged in cool cellars within oak barrels. Vinegar was used to preserve, disinfect, and even heal wounds. Many storage rooms had entire shelves devoted to liquids, since ale and wine could sustain morale when food ran short. There were no labels, no expiry dates, no certainty. Only skill, patience, and faith that what they saved in summer would keep them alive through winter. Now we turn to what these stores actually held, because the contents of a castle's pantry revealed its soul. The supplies told you who lived there, how they planned to survive, and who they expected to feed. These were not just storerooms. They were maps of endurance written in grain, beans, and salt. Step closer and look around. There is wheat flour for the fine white loaves of the noble's table, barley and rye for the rough bread of workers, oats for porridge, animal feed, and thick stews, millet, spelt, and buckwheat for lean times or for livestock. A single castle could hold tons of grain, rotated and inspected regularly. Each had a purpose: to feed daily meals, to bake dry travel bread for soldiers, or to sustain everyone when the gates were closed and the world outside turned hostile. Bread was more than nourishment. It was everyday currency. Pork was preserved by salting, smoking, or sealing in fat. Beef was usually salted or dried into jerky. Venison was hunted, gifted, and smoked. Fowls such as goose, duck, and pigeon were often pickled or dried. Fish, especially salted herring, cod, and stockfish, filled storage barrels across many castles. These provisions were stored in wooden barrels, clay jars, or buried in sand or ash to keep away moisture. They served many purposes, from feasts for nobles to rations for guards and patrols, or as fine meals for winter months. Hard cheese could last for months and was often traded between strongholds. Butter was used in cooking and sometimes coated over salted meats to preserve them. Whey was fed to pigs and even used as a cleaner substitute for water. Cheese remained a vital source of protein, long-lasting and reliable. Nothing went to waste. Ale, a mild barley drink, was brewed weekly and consumed daily. Mead, made from honey, was reserved for noble gatherings. Wine was common in southern or Norman castles, and vinegar was valued for cleaning, cooking, and fermenting vegetables. Alcoholic drinks lasted longer and were safer than most water sources. Soldiers drank ale, nobles preferred wine. Cabbage, turnips, leeks, and berries were stored hanging upside down. Garlic and onions were tied into bunches. Dried beans, lentils, and peas were prized for their endurance. Mustard seeds, caraway, and dill served both as spice and medicine. Seeds were guarded carefully, never to be used, for they were the lifeblood of the next season's crops. Honey, the one true non-perishable sweetener, replaced sugar in most recipes. Dried fruits like apples, pears, grapes, and prunes, along with almonds and walnuts, often found their way into both sweet and savory dishes. Salt was stored in solid blocks, useful for both animals and trade. Some were even given as rewards or used to buy loyalty. A castle with abundant honey often had many allies. Nobles ate white bread, rich meats, cheese, and wine. Servants dined on dark bread, ale, and root vegetables. Soldiers received salted meat, hard bread, and beer. Children survived on gruel and milk when available, with dried fruit as treats. And the war horses, consuming up to 15 pounds of oats each day, were as vital as soldiers themselves. You could measure a castle's readiness for war by the meals it served in peace. Yet all these hidden supplies meant little if they could not be moved. In the next stage comes the journey from storage to table, from the coldest cellars to the warmth of the great hall. Imagine a grand feast, a blazing fire, a noble lifting a goblet of wine. But behind that image lay endless work and countless unseen hands. Feeding a medieval castle was a complex system, and every link needed to hold, from basement to banquet. Each dawn, trusted servants descended into the storerooms. They gathered precise amounts of grain, meat, ale, vinegar, vegetables, and herbs, never more than ordered. Every portion was recorded and verified. In some places, stewards carried heavy rings of keys as marks of their authority and duty. If food went missing, the punishment was severe. Supplies were hauled up steep stairways, through narrow halls, past guards and servants, in sacks, crates, or balanced on poles. When possible, kitchens were built directly above storage rooms to shorten the route. Most large kitchens were central to the castle, built with chimneys and vents to release smoke. They were hot, crowded, and constantly alive with noise and motion. Fire was always a lurking danger. A large kitchen had a master cook, assistants, boys for washing pots, bakers with their own ovens, butchers for meat, and spicers for herbs. Cooking was not glamorous. It was disciplined labor. Boiling was favored over roasting to save fuel. Bread baking took turns, using great ovens shared by all. Some stews simmered all day. Salt was precious and carefully rationed. Burned food was passed to servants, never nobles. Meals were served by rank. Nobles ate in the great hall, with retainers serving from metal plates or bread trenchers. Knights and officers dined in side rooms on smaller, simpler dishes. Servants and soldiers ate in the courtyard or common hall, their meals often cold by the time they arrived. Workers, children, and stable hands ate last, sharing whatever remained. Many castles employed food stewards to manage every portion. Their job was to balance fairness with survival. They tracked attendance, illness, workload, and supplies. They knew who needed more, who could spare less, and when to switch to stored reserves. During a siege, one change in the plan could determine whether the castle endured or starved. Meat disappeared, bread grew thinner, and ale was stretched with water. Yet even during peace, the castle followed a rule that never changed. Discipline sustained more than flour ever could. Castles were built for war, but they also functioned as machines of feeding. From cellar to bowl, every portion was carefully measured. But what happened when the gates closed and the enemy arrived? The true trial of the castle pantry began not at a feast or harvest, but during a siege, where food no longer simply nourished, but determined survival. The gates slammed shut, the drawbridge lifted, torches flickered on the walls, and in an instant, the castle became something else. No longer a home, but a fortress and a prison under siege. No wagons entered, no messengers escaped, no grain, milk, or meat arrived. From that moment forward, everyone ate only what had been stored, no more and no less. Siege warfare was not swift. It was deliberate and cruel starvation. Some sieges lasted for days, others for weeks, and the longest stretched into months or even years. Rochester Castle in 1215 held out for 2 months. Harlech Castle from 1461 to 1468 endured 7 years through clever resupply. Montségur in 1244 surrendered not when its fighters fell, but when its grain was gone. A fortress could survive fire and sword, but never hunger. Once the siege began, the pantry became the war council. How long could they hold out? What to open first? Who would eat and who would not? From the first day, rations were altered. Bread was thinner, meat turned into broth, and everything was stretched with water. Nothing was eaten that had not been measured. Strict rules were written and obeyed. Some lords even sealed smaller cellars as a final emergency reserve. Stewards turned into commanders of the kitchen front. The healthy worked harder and earned more porridge. The sick received less. Soldiers relied on cereals and salted meat. The old and the young were given only soup or boiled roots. In some castles, wooden food tokens were issued with names carved upon them to prevent theft or unfair portions. Anyone caught stealing or eating in secret faced imprisonment at once, sometimes punished publicly to scare others. Many castles kept hidden storage rooms. Only the master and the steward knew where they were. Inside, they stored food for the final days, or goods for barter in case of negotiation. Often, a few bottles of wine were hidden away to celebrate survival, or the last rations were saved for the leaders who refused to yield. When sieges dragged on too long, desperation bred invention. Shoe leather was boiled until soft enough to chew. Soups were made from bark, weeds, and wild roots. Mice, sparrows, cats, and dogs became unexpected meals. Old accounts tell of bread baked from ash mixed with stale oats. It was not food anymore, only endurance. One French record from the 14th century tells of the 27th day of a siege when the last grain was gone. Saddles were boiled for their leather. By the 34th day, a mother divided a single onion into 3 pieces for her children. Not every castle fell to battering rams. Some fell to starvation. Food decided not only who lived, but how long a castle could hold out. For those who survived, the pantry became a sacred place of memory. In the next account, we hear of such stories when the last barrel fed the last man. There always came a moment when the final loaf was shared, the final barrel emptied, and the last candles melted to waxy stubs. In that moment, the pantry ceased to be a storage room and became the symbol of endurance. If it lasted just one more day, it meant life. During a 14th century siege, the defenders of Edinburgh Castle were left with a single bag of oats. Instead of saving it, they hurled it over the wall to mock the attackers, pretending they had plenty left. The besiegers believed the act and retreated. That bag of oats was not food. It was courage. In another tale, a hidden cellar under a chapel wall was accidentally opened during a siege in 1360. Inside were sealed pots of dried apples, preserved pork, and 2 casks of mead still drinkable. It fed 14 men for 9 extra days until reinforcements came. One survivor later wrote, "I thanked not the sword, but the salt." In some fortresses, food was hidden deep within water wells, lowered in clay jars tied with rope. Cool, damp, and unseen, they stayed untouched for months. One legend tells of a castle nearly lost until a child drew up a bucket from the well and found pickled eggs and cheese left behind by an earlier steward. Those forgotten stores kept them alive long enough to see another sunrise. That night they finally ate. By morning, the siege was over. For the builders of castles, storage was not just about food, it was about time itself. A small keep could last 2 or 3 weeks. A royal fortress might hold out 3 to 6 months. A trade castle beside a river could endure for a year or even longer. Some architects added secret tunnels and narrow hatches between towers to move supplies unseen. If the outer wall fell, another pantry might still be standing. Old stories tell of defenders kneeling over crumbs, lighting candles inside empty storerooms, or drawing pictures of grain on the walls as symbols of faith. Because in the end, the pantry was more than food. It was the final act of sharing before the gates opened, whether in defeat or deliverance. Perhaps the true legacy of medieval castles is not their towers, nor their gates, nor their moats, but the quiet rooms beneath them, the ones that held grain instead of glory, cheese instead of crowns. When fire raged and blades clashed, it was the cellar that chose who lived to tell the tale. In our last reflection, we look at the hidden strength of food and how something as plain as bread shaped the fate of entire empires. When you picture a medieval castle, you might see iron gates, flaming torches, armored knights, and proud lords sitting in grand halls. Yet beneath that might, below the cold stones and the heavy walls, lay what truly held everything together: the pantry. It was never beautiful, never celebrated, but utterly necessary. A sword hanging on the wall shouted power, while a sack of barley stored in the dark whispered endurance. And often it was that whisper that won the war. It was not the height of the tower or the depth of the moat that mattered most. It was how much grain was stored, how well the pork was sealed, and how long the people could wait. In the end, it was not the knight with the blade who decided victory, but the steward with the keys to the cellar. Kings ruled from their thrones. Lords commanded from their towers. But survival was born in rooms without windows, without banners, without crowns, filled with the scent of vinegar, smoke, cheese rind, and aging barley. Those were the places where victory began, long before the first arrow took flight. We admire the stonework. We praise the great halls. We take photos of the towers. Yet few ever wonder where the flour was kept, where the onions were hung, or who lit the first candle to check the meat. Those small acts decided everything. So the next time you think of kings and castles, remember this truth. Before they could conquer, they had to cook. Before they could defend, they had to preserve. Before they could triumph, they had to eat. And deep within the cold heart of the fortress, someone was already preparing that victory. Which part of castle life surprised you most? Leave your thoughts below. And if you think you could survive a siege with only oats and onions, remember to like and subscribe. When we look beyond the myths and see the true world of the Middle Ages, we realize those people were far wiser and more resourceful than we often believe.